There is a sound that soldiers across 1,000 worlds describe the same way, no matter what language they speak, no matter what culture shaped them, no matter what wars or centuries separate the moment of hearing it from the moment of trying to explain it to someone who has not been there. It is not the crack of bolter fire or the mechanical shriek of chain blades winding up to full rotational speed. Those sounds, for all the terror they carry, are identifiable. They belong to the vocabulary of warfare that soldiers are trained to process. You hear them and something in your brain says, weapon, distance, direction. Something in your brain starts working on the problem of them, starts looking for cover and assessing exit routes and calculating odds. Those sounds are frightening, but they are manageable frightening, the kind that experienced soldiers have learned to function within. This sound is different. It comes before all of that. It is something lower in frequency than you expect, something that you feel in the chest cavity and the base of the skull before you consciously register it with your ears. It is the sound of a tide. Not water, not wind, not anything elemental in the natural sense of that word. It is the sound of bodies. Hundreds upon hundreds of massive, heavily armored bodies, each one massing several times what a large human male would mass, each one moving at a speed that their bulk should not permit, at a dead sprint across open ground, screaming with a quality of fury that is not professional and is not trained and is not the controlled aggression of warriors, doing their jobs with effective intensity. It is something older and darker and more fundamental than any of that. It comes from pain. From a pain so total and so absolute and so woven into the very architecture of the consciousness, experiencing it, that the only accessible relief from it is to lose it, briefly, in the animal immediacy of killing something. Not defeating something, not subduing something, killing it. That sound, that low, terrible thunder of mass and momentum and screaming, is the last thing a great many people in the history of the galaxy have ever experienced. And the beings making it are not demons, though in some ways they have become something close. They are not mindless animals, though the line between what they were and what they have become is thinner than the edge of an axe. They are space marines, chaos space marines. The 12th Legion of the original 20, the ones the Emperor of Mankind himself once called his warhounds, the ones who were forged in the fires of the Great Crusade as instruments of unity and conquest. Now they serve something else entirely. Now they run across the ruins of burning worlds, with chain axes screaming and skulls already strapped to their belts, and they do not slow down, and they do not stop, and they do not ask for surrender. They are the World Eaters. And this is their story. Pull back a moment, because to understand what the World Eaters are, you have to understand what they were meant to be. When the Emperor of Mankind set out to reunite the scattered fragments of humanity across the stars, he built 20 legions of superhuman warriors to carry out that vision. Each legion was a reflection of its primarch, its gene father, the demigod around whom its genetic identity was shaped. The Space Wolves were hunters and lords of war in the old Viking tradition. The Ultramarines were tacticians and administrators, the perfect military machine. The Blood Angels were artists and angels who hid something monstrous behind an impossibly beautiful facade. The 12th Legion, the ones who would become the World Eaters, were something different from all of them. Even before they found their primarch, even before the course of their fate was set, there was something in the genetic selection of those first recruits that made other legions uneasy. Something in the way they fought that went beyond the calculated ferocity expected of Astartes. Something in their eyes, even behind their helmets, that suggested the thing inside was not entirely content to follow orders and follow tactical doctrine and stop when told to stop. The Emperor saw it, his advisors saw it, and they used it. For a while, because a weapon is only dangerous when it turns on the hand holding it. For decades, the 12th Legion was a tool pointed at the hardest jobs, the worst places, the enemies that needed not just defeating but annihilating utterly. They were good at their work, terrifyingly good. The problem was that they were also the kind of tool that had its own opinions about direction. And then they found Angron. And everything that had been simmering beneath the surface of the 12th Legion for decades came rushing up at once, like blood from a wound that had been held closed by pressure for too long. The moment that pressure was released, the stain spread so fast and so completely that there was never any real chance of washing it out. What followed is one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the Warhammer universe, because Angron was not simply a villain. He was not a creature of simple malice who chose darkness for the pleasure of it. He was a man who had been broken so thoroughly, in such fundamental ways, that the version of him who became the Red Angel of Khorne was, in some terrible sense, the only version of him that was ever possible. The Butcher's Nails did not create Angron's rage. They locked the door on everything else. We are going to walk through all of it, from the first days of the 12th Legion on Terra, through the finding of Angron on Nuceria and the horror of what had been done to him there, through the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy and the Siege of Terra and the long, blood-soaked 10,000 years that came after. We are going to talk about Kharn the Betrayer, about the Battle of Scalathrax, about the First War for Armageddon, about what the World Eaters are doing in the 41st millennium, as the Great Rift tears the galaxy apart, and the blood crusades pour out of the Eye of Terror like a hemorrhage that cannot be staunched. So settle in, keep the lights low, let's do this properly. And if you're enjoying this so far, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It genuinely means everything to know this is reaching people across the world at every hour of the day and night. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. More lore like this comes out regularly, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Part 2. Born in Terra's Shadows. The Warhounds. The earliest records of the 12th Legion are incomplete in ways that feel deliberate. When historians in the Imperium try to piece together the story of how the Legion, now known as the World Eaters, came to be, they run into gaps that seem less like accidents of record-keeping and more like the kind of carefully managed silence that powerful institutions create around things they would prefer not to explain. What we do know is that the 12th Legion was formed on Terra, like all the original legions, during the age of the Emperor's great project of reunification. The process of selecting recruits was consistent across all legions in its basic outline: find exceptional candidates from the population, implant the gene seed of the relevant Primarch, train them, send them to war, but the details varied enormously from one legion to another. For the 12th, the selection process seems to have favored what the official records describe only as aggressive and competitive candidates. There is no more detail than that. No named campaigns from the recruiters, no descriptions of the testing process, just a quiet acknowledgement that the people who were chosen to become the Warhounds were chosen, at least in part, because of their capacity for violence. The records also note something unusual for a Space Marine Legion of this era. After a single engagement during the Unification Wars, a campaign called the Saafrik Liberation, the 12th Legion vanished from the official record of operations for what appears to have been a significant stretch of time. They did not appear in any of the subsequent campaigns of the Unification Wars. They were not listed among the forces that helped pacify the solar system. They were simply, for a period, not mentioned. The theories about why are many. The one that gains the most traction among lore scholars is that something happened, something involving the 12th Legion's behavior or disposition that caused the Emperor to hold them back. Perhaps there was an incident of uncontrolled violence against allies. Perhaps there was a breakdown of command structure, the kind of internal bloodshed between battle brothers that would later become formalized under the decimation rituals of Angron's era. Perhaps the Emperor simply looked at what he had created in the 12th Legion and felt, for the first time, genuinely uncertain about how to use them safely. Whatever the reason, the 12th Legion spent those years in training. Relentless, obsessive, almost ritualistic training. And if there is one thing that emerges very clearly from the fragmentary records of that period, it is that the officers of the Legion enforced a code of internal discipline that was, by the standards of Space Marine legions, extraordinarily harsh. This was not simply a function of military rigor. This was the code that emerges when you are trying to manage something that is very close to the edge of control at all times. When your own men need to be kept from turning on each other between deployments, the symbol they adopted during this period tells you a great deal about how they understood themselves. A red hound, not a wolf, not a lion, not an eagle. All those animals that carry connotations of nobility and majesty. A hound. Specifically, a warhound, which is something rather different from a hunting dog or a companion animal. A warhound is a creature bred entirely for aggression, kept hungry just enough trained to charge and tear and not stop until commanded to stop. The name the emperor gave them, warhounds, was apparently bestowed after they pacified the narco-sprawls of the Cephalic hives with such ferocious efficiency that even the emperor felt something approaching admiration for the savagery of it. When they were finally let loose on their first major Great Crusade deployment, the results were instructive. The imperial colony on Cerberus had risen in rebellion. Standard procedure would have been to send in forces capable of making a distinction between combatants and non-combatants, perhaps accepting the surrender of those who laid down arms, processing prisoners, attempting to preserve the population as a resource for the Imperium going forward. The warhounds were dispatched at 03:00 hours. The all-clear signal came through at 08:08 that same morning. When the commanding officer was asked how many prisoners were waiting for processing, his response was that he had not taken any. In 5 hours and 8 minutes, the warhounds had gone through that colony like a fire through dry wood. And when they came out the other side, there was nothing left that needed to be processed. The record of that action was noted. Concerns were raised in the right places. The War Council, that oversaw imperial military operations, imposed stricter discipline around warhounds deployments. But the underlying problem could not be solved by paperwork or command structure, because the underlying problem was not a failure of discipline. It was the opposite. The warhounds were following their nature with perfect consistency. They had simply been built, however accidentally, to kill until there was nothing left to kill, and no amount of operational parameters in the briefing documents was going to change that. Through the early decades of the Great Crusade, the warhounds built a reputation that made other legions uncomfortable. The Space Wolves, who were themselves hardly known for restraint, found the warhounds difficult to operate alongside. The Ultramarines, who prized tactical efficiency and proportional response, found working with them nearly impossible. The rumors that circulated about them were consistent and ugly. They killed allies who disappointed them in battle. They did not take prisoners from any faction, human or Xenos, or anything in between. A warhound's deployment, it was said, had exactly two possible outcomes: victorious slaughter or just slaughter. And yet the Emperor kept using them, because there were some problems that could only be solved with a hammer, and the warhounds were the most effective hammer in his arsenal for a certain category of work. You needed a compliance carried out to the bone. You needed a world that would not simply be defeated, but would be so thoroughly scoured that the memory of resistance would not survive long enough to seed future rebellion. In those moments, the warhounds were the answer. Expensive, unpredictable, terrifying even to their own commanders, but effective. Around 8,000 of them were grouped into what was called the 13th Expeditionary Fleet, which became their primary operational home during the Great Crusade. They fought alongside Imperial Army units, though never comfortably, since the normal human soldiers found sharing a battlefield with the warhounds almost as frightening as fighting the enemy. They were deployed into some of the most brutal campaigns of the early Crusade, and they excelled in all of them, which is to say, they killed everything the Emperor pointed them at, and then stood there, dripping and waiting for another assignment. This is the legion that Angron inherited. This is the raw material that met him when the Emperor brought him up from the surface of Nuceria. And the first thing Angron did when he took command was look at the discipline and the code of conduct and the operational parameters, and he set all of it on fire. Not metaphorically. Well, perhaps somewhat metaphorically, but the effect was the same. Within months of his arrival, everything that had held the 12th Legion together as something approaching a functional military organization was dismantled and replaced with something that worked on entirely different principles. To understand why, you have to understand what Angron was. And to understand what Angron was, you have to go to Nuceria. Part 3. The Slave of Nuceria, Angron's Origin. Every Primarch has an origin story, and most of them are built around a kind of painful heroism. They land on harsh worlds, they struggle, they rise, they become leaders of those worlds through strength or wisdom or both. Vulcan walking through fire, Leman Russ running with wolves, Robut Guillemon reorganizing a civilization from the ground up. These are stories about extraordinary people discovering their extraordinary nature and stepping into their destiny with something approaching dignity. Angron's story is not like that. Angron's story is about what happens when something extraordinary is used as a tool from the very first moment of its existence and never given a single opportunity to be anything else. When the Emperor created his Primarchs, they were scattered across the galaxy through the interference of the Chaos Gods before they could be raised in his care. Each infant demigod landed somewhere different, beginning a life that was shaped entirely by the circumstances of where they fell. For Angron, that place was Nuceria. Nuceria was a world that thought of itself as civilized. It had cities and palaces and a ruling class that dressed itself in the language of culture and refinement. It had arts and entertainments and public ceremonies. It also had gladiatorial arenas, which were not a side product of its culture, but central to it, the main entertainment of the ruling elite, the principal form of public spectacle, the mechanism by which the ruling class demonstrated its power over those it held in bondage. The young Primarch who landed there was found wounded, probably from his chaotic journey through the warp, and rather than being cared for as the miraculous being he was identified as an asset, something with obvious physical potential, something that could be sold. He was taken to the city-state of Deshe, sold to the ruling clan, the Thalkir, and delivered to the largest and most popular arena on the planet. They gave him a name, Angron Thalkir, which marked him as property of the house that had purchased him. They nursed him back to health, which was not generosity but investment. And then they did something that defined everything that followed. They hammered the butcher's nails into his skull. The procedure was brutal in its physical reality and catastrophic in its psychological consequences. The nails were cybernetic implants, driven into the skull and surgically grafted to the cerebral cortex, interfacing directly with the organic brain tissue in ways that the slaves who administered the procedure barely understood, and the ruling class that commissioned it understood not at all. What they knew, what mattered to them, was the effect. The nails suppressed the production of serotonin in the subject's brain, which is the neurotransmitter most associated with contentment, social bonding, and the capacity for patience. At the same time, they deadened emotional responses across most of the brain's normal processing. The ability to feel happiness, love, connection, the sensation of peace while leaving absolutely intact, and in fact amplifying, the neurological pathways associated with aggression and rage. The result, in simple terms, was a mind that lived in constant pain. Not physical pain, exactly, or not only physical, though the interference of the nails with normal brain function produced severe headaches and neurological stress that only worsened over time. The pain was deeper than that. It was the pain of a consciousness that had been surgically stripped of most of the things that make consciousness bearable. The nails could not be removed. The Emperor himself, when he later examined Angron while the Primarch lay unconscious, determined that the device's tendrils had grown so deep into the brain and spine that removal would kill him. Angron was missing his limbic lobe and his insular cortex. The butcher's nails had literally replaced parts of his brain, and there was a specific, cruel design logic to this. The nails did not simply turn the subject into a mindless berserker. They did something more targeted. They made combat the only respite from the pain. When the subject was fighting, when adrenaline was flooding the system, and the primal mechanisms of violence were fully engaged, the nails eased. Not much, not enough, but enough to make the difference between agony and something that could be endured. Which meant the subject did not simply want to fight. The subject needed to fight, the way a person dying of thirst needs water. The gladiatorial arena was not simply a place of suffering for Angron. It was the only place where the suffering became briefly manageable. This is what the people of Nuceria did to a Primarch, to a demigod, to something that, in another life, might have stood at the Emperor's right hand and shaped the destiny of the galaxy. They turned him into the most spectacular entertainment their arenas had ever seen, and they called him Angron Thalkir, Lord of the Red Sands, and they watched him kill with the detached appreciation of people who have never once considered that the thing in the arena might have interiority worth considering. Despite everything, Angron developed something inside those conditions. He found a mentor, an older gladiator named Onomaus, who had been fighting in the arenas long enough to have accumulated something approaching wisdom about survival in that context. Under Onomaus, Angron learned not just to fight, but to think inside combat, to read opponents, to fight with a tactical intelligence that went far beyond the raw physical power any of the arena's other gladiators possessed. He also found, in the strange fellowship of the slave pits, something that might be called brotherhood. People who shared his chains and his suffering, who he could protect, who gave him a reason to care about the outcome of any given fight beyond simply managing his own pain. He learned to spare opponents who fought well, which was itself a kind of defiance of the arena's logic, a statement that the fighter in front of him deserved respect, that the audience watching above did not deserve to receive. He cultivated a community of slaves who looked to him not just as a champion, but as a leader. And eventually, when the number of those slaves had grown large enough, and Angron's authority among them had become solid enough, he did what only someone with the physical capability of a Primarch could even attempt. He led a slave rebellion. The uprising was violent and total. Angron led his brothers and sisters out of the slave pits and across New Syria, burning and fighting as they went, rallying more escaped slaves as their numbers grew, heading for the high mountain passes where they might make a stand on ground of their own choosing. The High Riders, as the ruling class was called, sent forces after them, and those forces were ground apart against Angron and his people in engagement after engagement. A Primarch, leading an army of fighters who had spent their entire lives in combat against troops who had never had to fight for their lives against anything approaching a peer. It was not a contest. It was a series of massacres, just in the opposite direction than anyone on New Syria had planned. But the mathematics of a rebellion are not always in the rebellion's favor. The High Riders could absorb losses in a way that Angron's people could not. Every fighter who fell beside him was irreplaceable. The army that the ruling class could field was enormous compared to what the slaves could muster. And when Angron finally reached the mountain passes he had been driving toward, the scale of the force arrayed against him was enough to give even a Primarch pause. He chose to stay. He chose to make his stand there, knowing it would almost certainly be his last, knowing that the people beside him would die, but that they would die as free fighters rather than as arena slaves. There is something in this that speaks to the tragedy that defines Angron's entire story. He had found, in the mountains of New Syria, with his ragged army of liberated slaves, something that the butcher's nails had tried to take from him, a reason beyond survival, a purpose that was about something other than killing, and he was going to lose it. Then the Emperor arrived. The teleportation beam that picked Angron up off that mountain and placed him aboard the Warhound's flagship was, in the timeline of events, the most catastrophic single moment in the history of the 12th Legion, even though it looked from the outside like a rescue. The Emperor took Angron away from the mountain. He left every single one of Angron's brothers and sisters behind. The High Riders, deprived of their primary target, slaughtered all of them. Every person who had chosen to stand and fight with Angron, who had placed their faith in his leadership, who had allowed themselves to hope that the slave rebellion might actually end in something other than death, every one of them died on that mountain while Angron, unable to intervene, was carried away to a destiny he had never wanted. It is very difficult to overstate what this moment did to Angron. In a brain already damaged by the butcher's nails, already stripped of most of its capacity for peace or contentment or trust, the abandonment of his people by the Emperor was not simply a political betrayal. It was the confirmation of every terrible thing the world had already taught him. That power exists to use the powerless. That those above will always sacrifice those below when it is convenient. That there is no loyalty or love that cannot be discarded when someone with more strength decides they have a use for you that matters more. The Emperor did not understand this, or he understood it and calculated that it was an acceptable cost. Either way, Angron arrived among the Warhounds as a man in whose heart something essential had been broken in a way that could not be repaired, and the Emperor handed him command of a legion and expected him to become a useful part of his great crusade. The outcome was never in any serious doubt. Part 4. The Butcher's Nails. The device that damned a legion. The Butcher's Nails are the single most important fact about the World Eaters, more important than any battle they fought or any world they destroyed or any enemy they tore apart. Everything that the 12th Legion became flows from those devices and what they did to the people who bore them. To understand them properly, you have to understand what they were before they were a weapon and before they were a damnation. They originated on New Syria as a tool of control, which is an ugly thing to sit with. They were developed by the slave lords of that world, not as a weapon of war, not even primarily, but as a mechanism for creating better gladiators, which is to say, more profitable ones. The Nucerian ruling class discovered that certain types of cybernetic interference with the brain's chemistry could produce gladiatorial slaves who fought with greater ferocity, who recovered faster from injuries, who showed less inclination to surrender or to refuse engagement, even under conditions that would have caused any rational person to stop. What they were creating, though they did not think of it in these terms, was a mechanism for removing the parts of the human mind that create hesitation, empathy, the capacity to imagine that the person you're fighting is also a person who is suffering. The nails did not make their subjects fearless, because fear is a useful emotion. In combat, it raises alertness and speeds reaction time. What they suppressed was everything that makes a fighter step back from the brink, the decision to stop, the moment of mercy, the ability to feel satisfied with a victory that does not end in absolute destruction. When Angron arrived among the Warhounds, he carried this technology with him, and he shares it, initially, not through any grand program or tactical vision, but because he looked at his new legion and saw, perhaps, the only path to any kind of connection with beings who were supposed to be his sons. The nails had defined his existence for as long as he could remember. They were the framework within which he understood combat and pain, and the relationship between the two. Giving them to the Warhounds was, in a deeply troubled way, an act of communion. He was making them like him. A magos of the Mechanicum named Galen Surlak was the one who found a way to replicate the nails using Angron's implants as a template. This was not a straightforward process. The original nails were archaeotech, which is to say, they came from the dark age of technology, a period whose knowledge was largely lost and whose surviving artifacts could be studied but not always fully understood. The versions that Surlak created were imperfect copies. They achieved some of the same effects, but with much cruder execution, which meant the pain they generated was worse, the loss of function was greater, and the neurological degradation they caused over time was more aggressive. Every World Eater who received the nails was, from that moment, dying by degrees. The implants interfaced with the brain's organic tissue in ways that could not be undone, and as time went on, the damage accumulated. The nails consumed the parts of the brain they touched. Slowly, they ate away at the higher functions of cognition, at strategic thinking, at the capacity for emotional complexity, at everything that made the World Eaters more than simply very large and very armored biological weapons. And as each of those functions diminished, the warrior who had possessed them became more completely what the nails were designed to produce. A fighter who needed to fight the way the body needs to breathe. Karn the Betrayer, whose story we will come to in depth, was the first warhound to voluntarily receive the nails. He was not coerced. He chose them. And this tells you something about the cultural logic that was already developing within the 12th Legion, even before the full program of implantation took hold. There was, among the warhounds, a sense that the nails were not simply a modification but a form of solidarity with their Primarch. To bear the same pain he bore was to stand beside him in a way that words and oaths could not achieve. It was a deeply human impulse, the desire to share a suffering that cannot be transferred or diminished. To say, I see what you carry, and I will carry some of it with you, expressed through an act that was fundamentally destructive. Not all of the warhounds accepted the nails without resistance. There were officers, veterans who had been in the Legion since before Angron's arrived emperor, who understood clearly what the implants would do over time, and who objected to the program as a form of self-destruction. A centurion named Mago led the most vocal opposition, arguing that the nails would doom the Legion, that they were not enhancement but degradation, that warriors who surrendered their capacity for strategic thought in exchange for greater ferocity were not more effective soldiers, but less. He was right on every point. Angron and Karn responded by having him killed, and his unit, and anyone else who declined. And this is where a crucial piece of the World Eater's cultural identity crystallized. Because after the rebellion was put down, the punishment for the dissenting unit was not simply execution. It was the practice that Angron had brought with him from Nuceria, the tradition of the gladiatorial arena, decimation. 1 out of every 10 warriors in a unit that had failed or disobeyed was selected by lottery and killed by the remaining 9. This was the punishment inflicted on living units. It was also the punishment inflicted when a compliance action failed to meet Angron's brutal time constraints. The World Eaters set a target of subduing a world within 31 hours, which was the length of a Nucerian day. When they failed to meet that target, decimation followed. Think about what this means for the psychology of a legion. You are a space marine, a warrior who has sworn to protect humanity and serve the Emperor, and you live with the constant knowledge that if you fail to meet an arbitrary time limit set by a Primarch who judges failure by the standards of a gladiatorial arena, you might be selected by lottery to be beaten to death by your own brothers. Not as punishment for cowardice, not as punishment for betrayal, simply as a statement that the unit as a whole had not been savage enough, fast enough, destructive enough. The effect was predictable. The World Eaters became more savage. They became faster. They stopped taking prisoners and started channeling everything into speed of destruction, because a dead enemy cannot slow you down and cannot add minutes to the clock. And then they came back to camp and waited to see if they had been fast enough, if the clock had stopped in time, if the lottery would spare them this cycle. This is the culture Angron built for his legion. And it worked in the narrow military sense. The World Eaters under Angron were the most relentless, close combat force in the Great Crusade. Nothing could stand against them in melee. They broke lines that no one else could break. They took worlds that other legions had declared impossible. The cost was the thing that made them what they were. But the cost was invisible to anyone watching from the outside, counting compliances and victory tallies and recording the legion's remarkable effectiveness. The invisible cost was the men inside the armor, slowly losing, piece by piece, everything that made them men. Part 5. The Great Crusade's most savage hounds. There is a famous description of the Warhounds, later the World Eaters, that circulated among Imperial Army commanders during the Great Crusade. It said, simply, that a Warhound's deployment had only two outcomes: glorious, victorious slaughter, or just slaughter. The distinction was meant to indicate whether the slaughter had been directed at the enemy or had also consumed elements of the Imperial forces operating alongside them. The fact that this distinction was considered worth making says everything about how the 12th Legion was perceived by the rest of the Imperium's military apparatus during this period. In the early years of the Great Crusade, before Angron's arrival, the Warhounds had been difficult but manageable. They killed efficiently, they followed orders broadly, if not always in every specific detail, and the incidents where they turned on Allied units were relatively contained. Once Angron arrived and the Nails program began spreading through the Legion, the already fragile restraints began failing with increasing frequency. The process of renaming the Legion was itself a statement. They had been the Warhounds, a name that carried connotations of controlled aggression, of a leash even if a long one. Angron renamed them the World Eaters. The image that name conjures is not of control or of hounds straining, but still directed. It is of something that has consumed everything around it and is still hungry. Angron chose that name deliberately, from the gladiatorial tradition of his past. The greatest of Nuceria's arena champions were given names that reflected their appetite for destruction, and the World Eaters was the name for the one who had consumed every challenger in front of them. By the middle decades of the Great Crusade, the World Eaters' reputation was so extreme that most imperial military commanders would accept their assistance only with considerable reluctance. This created its own problems, because the World Eaters interpreted reluctance to work with them as an insult, and insults from those they considered lesser were not something the Legion's officers were inclined to absorb quietly. There are records of imperial commanders who declined World Eaters' support being found dead, in circumstances that were officially attributed to enemy action, but that raised eyebrows among those who knew the 12 Legion's habits. Among the campaigns that stand out from this period is the Second Compliance of Genna, which is notable partly for its military outcome and partly for what happened within the World Eaters' own ranks during it. Genna was a world that the Legion had failed to bring to compliance within the 31-hour limit in an earlier campaign, which had triggered a decimation. When they returned for the Second Compliance, the psychological pressure on the warriors of the Legion was extreme. They knew what failure would cost them again, and under that pressure, elements of the Legion began pushing further and further beyond the boundaries of anything the Mechanicum's Nails engineers had intended to enable. The nails were killing the Legion, not quickly, but inexorably. Officers who had received the implants earlier in the program were showing visible signs of cognitive degradation. Their tactical thinking was becoming simpler and more direct. Their ability to hold complex plans in mind over extended periods was eroding. Their patience was gone, and their pain was constant, which meant their need for combat was constant, which meant that periods of peace between campaigns became increasingly intolerable. This created a dynamic that Angron himself seems to have been aware of. Even through the fog of his own nails-induced suffering, he knew the implants were killing him. He had been told as much by the Archmagos, who examined him early in his time with the Legion. He knew they were killing his sons too, slowly, eating away at the things that made a warrior more than a weapon. And he continued the program anyway, because the alternative was to acknowledge that the thing the Emperor had rescued him to do was poison everything he touched, and that was a truth too large and too hopeless to face directly. The World Eaters during the Great Crusade were, in a very specific sense, a tragedy, still in the process of becoming. You could see all the elements converging. You could see what they had been in the older Terran veterans who still carried some memory of the discipline and the code of honor that had defined the Warhounds. You could see what they were becoming in the younger warriors who had received the nails early and in whom the degradation was already advanced. And you could see that the direction of travel was entirely one way. The Legion was not oscillating between its better and worse impulses. It was moving steadily and irreversibly towards something that had no good end. Other Primarchs raised concerns. Robert Guillemot of the Ultramarines, always inclined toward the rational assessment of systemic problems, argued that the World Eaters under Angron represented a danger not just to enemies, but to the Imperial project itself. Horus, the War Master, who was supposed to act as the Emperor's proxy in managing the legions, heard the concerns and largely agreed with them in principle, while doing very little practically to address them. The Emperor himself, when the issue was raised with him directly, is recorded as having acknowledged that the Butcher's nails were incompatible with Angron's long-term survival, while simultaneously indicating that no intervention was planned. The Emperor's reasons for this passivity are debated. One view is that he genuinely believed Angron and his legion were still useful enough to justify the cost, and that the cost was something for Angron to bear, not the Emperor to solve. Another view, darker and more uncomfortable, is that the Emperor understood what the World Eaters were becoming and had already written them off as a temporary asset, something to be used intensively while they were still functional, and then set aside when the damage became irreversible. Neither interpretation reflects particularly well on the Emperor. The first is callous. The second is monstrous. What is certain is that nothing was done. The World Eaters continued their campaigns. The nails continued their work. And when Horus finally declared his treachery and the lines of the coming war began to clarify, the World Eaters were exactly where you would expect to find them, on the side of the person who seemed most willing to give them the war they needed, the blood they craved, the violence that was the only thing that made the pain of the nails briefly bearable. Part 6. The Heresy begins. Betrayal at Istvan III. The Horus Heresy is the central catastrophe of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the event that broke the Imperium of Man from a civilization with genuine potential into the grimly enduring fortress state it became. It was not a simple war. It was a fracture, a division running down the middle of the Emperor's project, along every fault line that had been quietly accumulating for decades. For the World Eaters, the choice of which side to take was in some sense not a choice at all. Angron had never had any loyalty to the Emperor. He had been taken from his dying people against his will and given a role he had not asked for in a project he had never believed in. The only things he had ever cared about were dead on a mountain on Nuceria, and the Emperor who had allowed that to happen was not a father figure he felt any pull toward protecting. When Horus came to him with the promise of war and freedom from the Emperor's direction, the thing in Angron's chest that was still capable of making decisions said yes before the offer was fully made. The World Eaters were among the original 4 traitor legions alongside the Death Guard, the Word-Bearers, and Horus's own Sons of Horus when the heresy formally began. And they announced their treachery in the most World Eaters way imaginable, at Istvan III, in what became known as the Istvan III atrocity. Horus's opening move in the heresy was elegant in a terrible way. He identified which officers in each of the 4 legions were still genuinely loyal to the emperor, which officers could not be converted to the traitor cause regardless of pressure or persuasion, and he had them killed, not by enemy action, not in honorable battle. He gathered the loyalist officers of his own and the other 3 legions and landed them on Istvan III, ostensibly for a campaign against rebels on the surface. And then he ordered an orbital bombardment that was designed to kill everyone who had been sent down there. The World Eaters executed their part of this with the thoroughness you would expect. They had loyalist officers among their number, men whose attachment to the Emperor's vision for the galaxy was strong enough that Angron and his inner circle did not trust them to serve the traitor cause. Those men were sent down to the surface of Istvan III. And then the bombs fell. Some survived. The story of Istvan III is partly the story of the survivors on the surface, loyalists from all 4 legions who fought a desperate guerrilla war against their own brothers, while the traitors rained destruction on them from orbit and from ground level. Karn the Betrayer was among those who fought the loyalists on the ground, and it was here that his early corruption became something more definitive. He encountered a loyalist Sons of Horus captain named Loken in combat, was thrown against the teeth of a tank's dozer blade with enough force to impale his chest, and was left for dead. He survived. Of course he survived. Karn always survived, and we will get to why that is both remarkable and deeply unsettling in the section devoted to him. The Istvan III atrocity was followed by the Istvan V drop site massacre, which was where 3 more loyal legions were ambushed and largely destroyed, and from there the heresy moved into the phase that historians in the Imperium call the Shadow Crusade. The Shadow Crusade is where the World Eaters and the Word Bearers, led by their respective Primarchs Angron and Lorgar, were sent into the realm of Ultramar on a campaign of destruction designed to prevent the Ultramarines from reinforcing Terra when the time came for the final assault. It was strategic in its logic and savage in its execution. And for the World Eaters, it was the period in which what few remaining restraints on their behavior were systematically removed. It was also the campaign that brought them back to New Syria. Lorgar, who was Angron's closest brother among the Primarchs, despite being everything Angron was not, thoughtful, patient, deeply invested in the spiritual dimensions of chaos, had developed a plan. He recognized that Angron was dying. The Butcher's Nails were advancing their damage faster than anyone had initially projected. He estimated that Angron had perhaps months left before the deterioration became fatal, and Lorgar, who had already fully embraced the service of the Chaos Gods, had a solution in mind. But first, Angron wanted to go back to Nuceria, the world that had enslaved him, that had destroyed the people he loved, that had hammered the devices into his skull that were now killing him. He had unfinished business there. When the World Eaters and Word Bearers made orbit over Nuceria, they discovered that the High Riders had maintained their grip on power through the intervening years, and had, in fact, told the planetary population that Angron had died at the hands of their forces on that mountain, claiming credit for destroying something that had, in truth, only been taken from them by the Emperor. They had massacred every slave who had fought beside him, and they were continuing to run their arenas and their civilization just as before, as though the greatest warrior their world had ever produced had simply been a brief inconvenience. Angron ordered the purge. What followed was the complete destruction of Nucerian civilization. Both the World Eaters and the Word Bearers descended on the planet, and together they killed everyone. Not just the High Riders, not just the leadership or the military forces. Everyone, the entire population, every city, every town, every settlement was reduced to rubble and ash. Angron walked through the carnage carrying the remains of his fallen gladiatorial brothers and sisters, letting their empty skulls witness what was happening to the world that had used them and discarded them. He was grieving in the only way the Butcher's Nails left him capable of grieving, through total annihilation of the things that had caused the grief. And during that annihilation, as the blood ran in rivers down the streets of Nuceria's burning cities, Lorgar performed his ritual. Part 7. Angron Ascends. The Making of a Daemon Prince. The ritual that Lorgar performed on Nuceria was not something improvised. It was the result of planning, of consultation with the entities of the warp that Lorgar had already bound himself to, of careful consideration of what was needed and what would be offered in exchange. What was needed was a way to save Angron's life, or more precisely, to preserve and transform it, because the butcher's nails were destroying his mortal form. What was offered was the totality of Angron's being, body and soul, to the service of Khorne, the blood god, the chaos deity, whose domain encompassed war and murder and the simple, primal, absolutely non-negotiable imperative of violence. Khorne was, in the context of the chaos pantheon, the obvious patron for Angron. Tzeentch requires the capacity for scheming and patience that the butcher's nails had long since consumed. Slaanesh feeds on pleasure and sensation, which the nails had made largely inaccessible. Nurgle, the Plague Father, could not offer what Angron needed. But Khorne, the god who drinks the blood of the fallen and cares nothing for who spills it, who asks only for more and more combat and more death. Khorne was a perfect match for everything the butcher's nails had made Angron into. The ritual used the bloodshed of the Nucerian Purge as its fuel, the mass death of an entire planetary population, offered as a sacrifice, created an enormous surge of power in the warp, the kind of surge that allowed Lorgar to channel enough of Khorne's attention to effect the transformation. As the butcher's nails finally consumed the last of Angron's mortal brain function, as the Primarch literally died of the damage the devices had been inflicting since his childhood in the arena, Lorgar redirected that death. He took the energy of Angron's passing and fed it into the warp ritual, and Khorne reached through and took what was offered. Angron died. And then Angron came back. What came back was not the man who had stood on a mountain in Nuceria with his people, choosing to die free rather than be enslaved again. That man was gone, had been going for a long time, had been losing ground to the nails every day since childhood. What came back was the thing that the nails had been building in the space where that man had been. Something massive, something of brass and muscle and sinew and rage. Something with wings of bloody membrane, spreading wide enough to cast shadows over city blocks. Something that wore Angron's face, but had, behind the features, something ancient and terrible and deeply, completely alien to anything that had ever been human. A daemon prince of Khorne, the Red Angel. The transformation was simultaneously salvation and damnation, which is how Lorgar himself described it to those who asked. Salvation because Angron was no longer dying of the butcher's nails. Those devices were still present in his skull, still interfacing with whatever biological components remained in the entity he had become, but a daemon prince does not die of physical degradation the way a mortal does. He would persist now, for as long as Khorne willed it or until destroyed by sufficient force, and even then he could be reborn in the warp and reconstituted. Damnation, because what persisted was no longer anything that could be called a person. Whatever Angron had been before, angry, damaged, tragic, capable, despite everything of something approaching love for those who stood beside him, was burned away in the fire of the Ascension, leaving something that could feel only the hunger for blood and the satisfaction of feeding it. After the transformation, Angron's first act was characteristic. He spoke to Khorne, who had been present on Nuceria, and instructed him to go down to the lower decks of the Legion's flagship, the Conqueror, and massacre the slaves there. Then, he ordered the survivors to build him a throne out of their skulls. This was not strategy. This was not tactics. This was the new order of things, made plain in the simplest possible terms. The World Eaters that followed the Daemon Prince Angron into the rest of the heresy were in many ways already indistinguishable from the entity that led them. The nails had done their work. The warriors of the 12th Legion had, by this point in the conflict, largely lost whatever made them individuals with inner lives worth accounting for. They fought because fighting was all they had. They killed because killing was the only relief from the constant, grinding, structural agony of the devices in their heads. They were not soldiers anymore. They were a force of nature in power armor, a tide of red and bone and screaming metal, and they were going to Terra. Part 8. The Siege of Terra. Blood at the Palace Gates. The Siege of Terra is the most important military event in the history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It is where the Horus Heresy ends, where the Emperor is destroyed and preserved, where the Golden Age of the Imperium concludes, and the long, dark, grinding endurance, that is, the 41st millennium, begins. And in the siege, the World Eaters played a role that was both crucial and essentially uncontrollable. The traitor forces that converged on Terra were enormous. Dozens of legions and their supporting forces, mortal armies numbering in the millions, war machines and demon engines and beings of pure warp energy. Against them, the Imperial defenders held the walls of the palace in what was, by any rational assessment, a hopeless last stand. The loyalist legions that had survived the heresy to this point were reduced, battered, running low on everything. The walls were vast, but the enemy was vaster. Into this came Angron and the World Eaters, and they hit the defensive lines of the Imperial Palace with a momentum that had no tactical finesse to it whatsoever and did not need any. Angron, now fully a daemon prince, demanded from the moment of arrival that Horus allow him to assault the palace directly. Horus, who still retained enough strategic sense to understand that a direct frontal assault was not optimal until the psychic barriers around the palace had been sufficiently weakened, had to use considerable effort to restrain Angron and direct his fury toward more immediately accessible targets. The Eternity Wall spaceport became one of the World Eaters' primary areas of operation. The defenders there were formidable. Knights of the Silent Sisterhood, Adeptus Custodes, Imperial Fists, Space Marines, Solar Auxilia units, some of the finest soldiers the Imperium had. The World Eaters under Angron swept through them. There was no other word for it. They came, and they killed. And when concentrated artillery fire, literally atomized, Angron reduced his physical manifestation to nothing. He simply reconstituted. You cannot kill a daemon prince with artillery, however good your artillery is. He walked back through the ruined spaceport and continued the assault, and eventually the Eternity Wall fell. Many heroes of the Imperium died there, unrecorded and unremembered by history. The siege continued. The World Eaters spread across the surface of Terra in a way that alarmed even their fellow traitor forces, because they made no distinction between military and civilian targets. The Emperor's children at least pursued their depravity with something approaching selectivity. The World Eaters simply killed everything in their path. Soldiers and civilians and servitors, and even on occasion, elements of other traitor forces who happened to be between them and the next target. The Blood God did not care who bled. The World Eaters had stopped caring too. At the gates of the Eternity Gate itself, the outermost entrance to the Emperor's throne room, Angron came face to face with Sanguinius, the winged Primarch of the Blood Angels. This meeting, even by the brutal standards of the siege, carried a specific weight. These were brothers, in the biological sense that all Primarchs were brothers, and in the scene as it is recorded, they faced each other before the walls, while the battle raged around them. The defenders of the palace, seeing Angron's monstrous form before their walls, might have broken entirely, had Sanguinius not been there. His presence, the angelic gravity of a Primarch, who was himself bearing the weight of a terrible doom he had seen in his own visions of the future, held the line. And eventually, Angron moved on to other parts of the battle, and Sanguinius went to meet his death at the hands of Horus. It is recorded that when the Emperor finally defeated Horus, and the traitor fleet fled, the World Eaters were the very last of the retreating forces to leave the field. When the order came to fall back, to break off, and make for the ships, the World Eaters did not respond in any timely way. They kept fighting. Their Primarch was already gone, already back in the warp or making his way off-world in the chaos of the retreat, but the Legion itself stood there in the ruins of whatever section of the Imperial Palace it had been attacking and continued to try to kill things, not from loyalty to Horus or commitment to the traitor cause. Because stopping was harder than continuing, and the blood all around them was still fresh, and the nails did not recognize concepts like strategic withdrawal or tactical disengagement. Eventually they were pulled out, or the targets were exhausted, or both. The traitor host fled into the warp, pursued by the victorious if devastated loyalists in what became known as the Great Scouring, and the World Eaters went with them, into the Eye of Terror, into a decade of internal conflict and further degradation toward the event that would finally break them as a legion. Part 9. The Night of Madness, Scalathrax, and the Breaking. The Great Scouring was, for the traitor legions, a period of desperate flight. The loyalists were victorious, motivated, and pursuing. The traitors were divided, disorganized, and running in multiple directions, Some went deep into the Eye of Terror immediately. Others tried to establish bases in the outer reaches of the galaxy. Many were hunted down and destroyed in the years following the heresy's end. For the World Eaters, the period immediately following the Siege of Terra was particularly chaotic. Angron had already ascended beyond the Legion's day-to-day reality. He was now a being of the warp, manifesting physically when the conditions allowed it, or when his attention was drawn to a particular point in the material universe, but no longer present as a constant Primarch figure around whom the Legion's remaining structure could organize. The World Eaters needed leadership, and what they had was a collection of captains and senior officers, most of them badly damaged by the nails, competing for authority in the way that Khornate warbands always compete, by seeing who was willing to be the most aggressive. Karn had been carried off the field of Terra with his body so destroyed by the battle that his battle brothers thought he was dead. He had died. And then he hadn't, which is a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his existence, and that speaks to something that even in the 41st millennium has not been fully explained. The degree to which Karn the Betrayer is protected by Khorne himself. Not granted immortality, exactly. Not made unable to die, but recovered, brought back from the brink by some mechanism that operates outside normal biology, given back to the battlefield for reasons that are Khorne's own. When Karn recovered, he found the Legion in a state of near disintegration. Without the organizing presence of Angron, without a clear enemy to focus on, the World Eaters were turning on each other with increasing frequency. The nails were still working their way through the brains of thousands of warriors, and the pain of peacetime, the absence of combat that provided the only relief from that pain, was driving them toward internecine conflict as a substitute. Different captains claimed different loyalties. Different warbands formed around different leaders. The cohesion that had held the Legion together during the heresy, however fragile it had always been, was coming apart at the seams. The collision with the Emperor's children on Scalathrax gave the surviving command structure of the World Eaters something they badly needed: a common enemy. The Emperor's children were the Legion of Slaanesh, dedicated to the pursuit of sensation in its most extreme forms, polar opposites of the World Eaters in terms of the specific quality of their corruption, but equals in terms of their complete departure from anything that had once been human. On Scalathrax, a daemon world deep in the Eye of Terror, the two legions found themselves competing for the same territory. The battle was fierce. The World Eaters pressed the Emperor's children hard, fighting with the relentless melee ferocity that had always been their defining characteristic. By the end of a full day of fighting, they were close to victory. The Emperor's children were falling back. The position was nearly secured, and then the Scalathrax night fell. Scalathrax was a world with a temperature differential between its day and its night that was not simply uncomfortable, but genuinely lethal. During the day, combat was possible. During the night, the cold was so severe that even a Chaos Space Marine, in full power armor, with a metabolism far beyond anything mortal, was at risk of dying if exposed to it for any extended period. Both sides knew this. When the night began to descend, commanders on both sides ordered their forces to seek shelter, to wait out the killing cold, to resume the battle when dawn returned. Karn looked at this. He looked at the order to take shelter. He looked at his battle brothers filing back to their positions and their makeshift fortifications against the cold. And something inside him that was already very nearly gone completed its breaking. He picked up a flamer. What followed is called the Night of Madness in the records, and that name is entirely appropriate. Karn walked into the retreating lines of the World Eaters and began burning the shelters. Buildings that could have housed fighters against the cold became pyres. His battle brothers who tried to stop him were cut down with his chain-axe Gorechild. Those who tried to flee were burned. And as the shelters burned and the cold of the Scalathrax night became inescapable, the World Eaters who had been driven out of shelter found themselves fighting the Emperor's children who had also been driven out, and then fighting each other, and then simply fighting anything that moved, because the Nails did not know the difference between friend and foe, and Karn had made it impossible for either legion to have shelter. By the time the Scalathrax night ended, both legions were broken. The Emperor's children, who had at least maintained some organizational coherence, were fractured. The World Eaters were shattered. The hundreds of warbands that had been loosely held together under the broad banner of the 12th Legion were now scattered across Scalathrax and beyond, Dozens of separate fragments, each following a different leader, or no leader at all, each pursuing the blood and the skulls that the nails demanded without any overarching strategy or common purpose. This is how the World Eaters became what they are in the 41st millennium. Not through a single dramatic choice, not through a moment of conscious self-destruction, but through the final, inevitable victory of the devices in their heads over whatever else they had once been. The Butcher's Nails had always been going to win. The only question was what the final accounting would look like when they did. Karn earned his epithet at Scalathrax, the betrayer, the one who had turned not just on enemies but on brothers, not just on one occasion but definitively, making the betrayal permanent by ensuring there was no longer any legion to betray. He had shattered the World Eaters with a flamer and a chain axe, and the last fully conscious act of a man who had already lost most of what made him a man. And then he disappeared into the Eye of Terror, because there was nowhere else to go, and the galaxy was very large and very full of things that could still bleed. Part 10. 10,000 years of slaughter. 10,000 years is a span of time that defeats the imagination when you try to apply it to human experience. In that time, the Imperium of Man has fought wars that each lasted generations, lost and recovered entire star systems, watched its founding generation become mythological figures whose true nature is disputed by the very institutions they created. The 41st millennium, the era in which Warhammer 40,000 is primarily set, is separated from the Horus heresy by that gulf of time, and most of what happened in the middle is fragmentary and contested. For the World Eaters, those 10,000 years were, broadly, more of the same. Warbands poured out of the Eye of Terror and fell upon Imperial worlds. They allied with other Chaos forces when it served their immediate purpose of acquiring more combat and retreated or dispersed when the pressure became too great. They participated in the Black Crusades, led by Abaddon, the Despoiler, the War Master of Chaos, who has made it his project to tear down the Imperium piece by piece over these millennia. The World Eaters made useful shock troops for those crusades. As they had been useful shock troops for Horus, the same calculation, the same logic, the same expenditure of their lives and souls in the service of someone else's strategy. The most significant single event in the World Eaters' post-heresy history before the era of the Great Rift is the First War for Armageddon, which took place in 444 of the 41st millennium. This was Angron's project. The Daemon Prince, for the first time in millennia, showed something approaching strategic ambition. He spent years working to gather the scattered warbands of the World Eaters back into something resembling a coherent force, calling on old bonds of brotherhood and the shared identity of Khorne's chosen warriors, appealing to the fragment of Legion memory that even 10,000 years of separation had not entirely erased. What he assembled was not the Great Crusade-era World Eaters Legion. It was a host of warbands whose members had spent millennia in the Eye of Terror, touched by chaos in ways that had advanced and accelerated the changes the Butcher's Nails had begun, many of them barely recognizable as the Space Marines they had once been. But it was the largest unified World Eaters force since Scalathrax, and when Angron pointed it at Armageddon, a massive, critically important imperial industrial world that served as a hub for the Segmentum Solar, the result was an invasion of catastrophic proportions. The World Eaters took the surface of Armageddon. City by city, district by district, they fought their way through the planet's defenses with the implacable momentum that had defined the 12th Legion's way of war since before the heresy. The Imperial defenders, however brave and however numerous, could not stop them. Armageddon was on the verge of being lost entirely. What stopped them was not conventional military force. It was the Grey Knights. The Grey Knights are a chapter of Space Marines whose entire existence is classified beyond almost all levels of Imperial security clearance, dedicated specifically to combating demonic incursion, trained and equipped in ways that go beyond what standard Astartes can bring to bear against entities of the warp. They have been used perhaps most dramatically against Angron himself on Armageddon, and the cost of that engagement tells you something about what Angron had become in the 10,000 years since his ascension. Angron was bound and banished back to the warp. Not killed, a Daemon Prince of that magnitude cannot simply be killed in the conventional sense, but removed from the material universe for a period of roughly 100 years, which in warp reckoning might mean almost anything. The Grey Knights who performed the ritual paid an enormous price for this, with many giving their lives to complete it. And Armageddon, though saved from total destruction, was so badly damaged that the Imperium chose to keep the entire war secret from its own population, scrubbing the records and suppressing the survivors to prevent knowledge of the demonic incursion from spreading. The subsequent 1,500 years of 41st millennium history saw the World Eaters continuing their pattern of warband raids, Black Crusade participation, and occasional larger offensives whenever enough of them could be gathered under a sufficiently charismatic, cornate lord. The Legion Wars in the Eye of Terror produced constant attrition. The World Eaters fought the Emperor's children. They fought the Death Guard. They fought the Iron Warriors and the Alpha Legion and the Night Lords and every other warband they encountered, because the Nails do not care about strategic alliances, only about available targets. And then the Great Rift opened. The Great Rift, the wound torn in the galaxy by the birth of the Chaos God Slanesh and the accumulated psychic trauma of the Horus Heresy, finally releasing its stored energy, changed everything. An enormous tear in real space, stretching from one end of the galaxy to the other, allowing warp energy and demonic forces to pour through in volumes and with a freedom that had not been possible before. The Imperium, already stretched beyond its capacity by the pressures of the 41st millennium, was suddenly split in two, with half of its territory cut off from Terra by the rift and left to manage on its own. For the World Eaters, the Great Rift was, as the records state with characteristic grimness, a gift. The warbands that had been scattered across the Eye of Terror and the wider galaxy emerged in numbers that had not been seen since the Heresy, spearheading what became known as the Blood Crusades, not one crusade but 8 simultaneous fronts of cornate assault, pushing into Imperial space from every direction the Rift had created access to. This was not a coordinated campaign in any tactical sense. It was a flood. Thousands of individual warbands, loosely united by the shared imperative that Khorne's worship had burned into every one of them, pouring through every gap the Rift had created and falling on everything in their path. The Imperium, dealing simultaneously with the Blood Crusades, the plague fleets of Nurgle, the technological offensive of the Necrons, the hyperspace predation of the Tyranids, and the internal fractures created by Robout Guilliman's return and the political chaos of the Indomitus Crusade, had no capacity to meet this threat comprehensively. Individual worlds fell, some were held. The Great Rift burned, and the Blood Crusades raged, and the skulls piled on Khorne's throne in numbers that had not been achieved since the darkest days of the Siege of Terra. Part 11 Sons of Khorne, Warriors, Monsters, and Champions. To understand the World Eaters as they exist in the 41st millennium, you have to understand the specific forms their corruption has taken, because this is not the simple story of Space Marines who chose the wrong side and are now generically evil. The World Eaters have developed a distinct culture and ecology of chaos worship, shaped by the specific nature of Khorne's demands and the specific legacy of the Butcher's Nails that produces warriors unlike anything else in the Warhammer universe. At the core of the World Eaters' fighting force are the Khorne Berserkers. These are what happens when you take a Space Marine who already carries the Butcher's Nails, expose him to 10,000 years of constant combat in the Eye of Terror, allow the psychological degradation of the Nails to advance through that period, and add the specific touch of Khorne's blessing to the result. A Khorne Berserker is not simply an angry Space Marine. The Nails have advanced so far that the capacity for strategic thought is vestigial at best. The pain of non-combat is so constant and so overwhelming that even the brief windows between engagements are experienced as a form of torture. When they finally close with an enemy, when the chain axes scream and the blood starts to flow, the relief is so profound that it functions like a drug, like the lifting of a weight that has been pressing on every nerve, ending simultaneously. Their equipment reflects this. They carry chain axes, not simply because chain swords were the World Eater's traditional weapon, but because a chain axe has more mass behind each blow, transfers more force into the target, produces more trauma per swing. They carry bolt pistols for the approach, but the goal is always to close the distance and make it a melee. Their armor is old and battered and covered in blood that may never have been cleaned, decorated with skulls and chains and the 8-pointed star of chaos, because Khorne is the 8th power. 8 being his sacred number. They do not take prisoners. They do not accept surrender. They kill until the enemy is gone, and then they kill each other until someone with the nails advanced enough to make the distinction between brother and foe restrains them. But even among Khorne berserkers, there is a hierarchy of escalation, and at the top of that hierarchy, in their current 41st millennium form, are the 8-bound. The 8-bound are what happens when the process of corruption goes one step further, through a deliberate ritual, rather than simply the accumulated damage of time. Particularly savage Khorne berserkers, warriors whose butcher's nails have advanced enough that they are barely functional in any cognitive sense, but whose physical effectiveness has reached a kind of peak, are subjected to a process that the World Eaters call the 8-cage. The warrior is locked in a sarcophagus, not unlike a dreadnought's shell, but built for a different purpose, entirely where probes and needles interface with their butcher's nails and expose them to the raw madness of the warp. Inside the 8-cage, the prisoner faces tests. Some of these tests are physical, bloody arena battles fought against demonic entities, while the prisoner's nervous system is directly interfaced with the warp's energies. Some of the tests are psychological in nature, or anti-psychological. More accurately, challenges to the last fragments of identity and selfhood that the nails have not yet consumed, with the goal of destroying those fragments entirely. Those who fail the trials die, or disappear, or are reduced to formless chaos spawn, the pathetic lost cases that litter the battlefields of chaos armies everywhere. Those who succeed emerge changed in a way that cannot be undone. 8 demons have possessed them, not one, not a handful. 8 discrete demonic entities, bound into the warrior's flesh and fused with what remains of his physical and spiritual being. The result is something that barely resembles a space marine, standing taller than standard Astartes by a significant margin, possessed of physical strength that can match a dreadnought in melee, moving with a speed and ferocity that makes even experienced warriors of the Imperium struggle to track visually. The 8-bound do not feel pain. The nails were the source of their pain, and now the nails are drowned out by the presence of 8 demonic entities, all screaming in unison inside the same skull. What remains is something that wants nothing in the universe except to fight, and that is supernaturally good at fighting, and that will not stop until the battlefield is empty or it is destroyed. The exalted 8-bound are the further extreme, 8-bound warriors who have earned additional favor from Khorne through the specificity and volume of their killing. Their physical forms show the influence of demonic possession more overtly, with mutations and growths and biological changes that push them further from anything recognizably humanoid. They can materialize behind enemy lines through a demonic deep strike capability that defies conventional understanding of spatial movement. They are anti-armor in a way that chain axes alone cannot achieve, with physical capabilities sufficient to tear open armored vehicles with their bare hands. Beyond these towering killing machines, the World Eaters' armies in the modern era include the Jockholes. These are not space marines at all. They are mortals, human cultists who have chosen to bind themselves to Khorne's service, who have sought out World Eaters' warbands and attached themselves to them in the hope that proximity to the chosen of the Blood God will grant them favor or protection, or simply the chance to die in combat rather than of age or illness or the ordinary miseries of life in the 41st millennium. They are not particularly powerful individually. They carry makeshift weapons and wear inadequate armor, but they are numerous and they are fanatical, and they serve as a living tide that advances ahead of the berserkers, clearing light resistance and drawing fire that the heavier units can then exploit. Then there is Kharn the Betrayer, who is, in the 41st millennium, something beyond simply a powerful warrior. Kharn is the greatest mortal champion of Khorne in the material universe, ranked second only to the Daemon Primarch Angron himself. His existence across 10,000 years of continuous combat has produced a warrior of such refined and absolute lethality that almost nothing can stand against him in single combat. He carries the chain axe Gorechild, one of the twin weapons that Angron had carried before his ascension, recovered by Kharn from the battlefield and repaired as an act of devotion to his Primarch. Gorechild has teeth taken from a mica dragon, which is about as exotic and deadly a cutting element as the 40K universe can provide. He also carries a plasma pistol that he has named Betrayer, because, of course he has. What makes Karn unique among the champions of chaos, and what makes him genuinely compelling as a character rather than simply a figure of horror, is that he has retained something. Not sanity, not loyalty in any conventional sense, not the capacity for mercy or restraint, but identity. He knows who he is. He remembers, in some fragmentary way, who he was. He refuses to fully surrender to the butcher's nails the way his brothers did. Not because he is stronger, but because the refusal itself is the thing he is most cornate about. He will not be made a slave. Not to the nails, not to corn, not to anything. The irony that this refusal serves Karn perfectly, that a warrior who fights to maintain his free will by fighting is exactly the kind of champion Karn most values, seems to be something Karn is grimly aware of. He has no illusions about what he is. He simply insists on being it consciously. His kill count is beyond calculation. He has a counter built into his helmet, a gift from the War Master Horus himself, that tallies kills in combat. The number on that counter after 10,000 years of near-constant fighting is not recorded anywhere in Imperial archives, because no Imperial archivist who has been close enough to read it has survived the encounter. He has killed brothers, enemies, allies, bystanders, and everything in between. He has been killed himself and come back. He is the living embodiment of the World Eater's paradox. The most fully cornate warrior in existence is the one who is doing it on his own terms. There are other champions who deserve mention. Lord Invocatus, a more recent addition to the World Eater's roster of named champions, rides a juggernaut of Khorne, one of the demonic brass-constructed creatures that serve as Khorne's cavalry through the sky, in burning trails that mark his path across battlefields. He leads the warband called the Fire Riders, whose preferred tactic is exactly what the name implies: a fast-moving, high-impact assault that hits the enemy line before the defenders have time to fully respond, burning everything that can burn, and crushing everything that cannot. He is not Karn in terms of raw, legendary stature, but he is a genuinely terrifying presence on any battlefield, and his approach to the World Eater's core philosophy of speed plus destruction has influenced the fighting style of multiple warbands. The World Eaters also deploy Daemon Engine's machines possessed by or suffused with demonic power in their campaigns. The Brass Scorpion and the Soul Grinder, massive Walker-class weapons, accompany their ground forces in major offensives. These are not creatures that respond to strategy or orders in any conventional sense. They follow the same imperative as everything else in a World Eater's force. Move toward the enemy, destroy the enemy, repeat until there is no more enemy. The overall tactical doctrine of the World Eaters in the 41st millennium is one of uncomplicated, overwhelming violence applied as fast as possible. They use transports, rhinos, and land raiders, ancient and battered, not for protection, but for delivery. The vehicles exist to get the berserkers and eightbound to the point of contact as quickly as possible, after which the transports are largely irrelevant. Once in melee, the World Eaters do not disengage. They do not fall back to consolidate. They kill until the thing they were killing is dead, and then they turn to the next target. The blessings of Khorne, the demonic gifts that their god showers on his favored warriors, manifest as enhanced strength and speed in the heat of combat, as the ability to fight on through damage that would kill most beings outright, as a supernatural resilience that has no medical explanation and no tactical counter. They are, in short, exactly as terrifying as they have always been. More so, in some ways, because 10,000 years of corruption have stripped away everything that was ever soft or hesitant about the World Eaters, and left only the thing that was always underneath, the unstoppable violence that was there in the 12th Legion from the very beginning, that the Emperor used and did not examine, that Angron amplified and refined, that Khorne claimed and consecrated. Part 12. The World Eaters Today. Wrath Without End. In the current era of the Warhammer 40,000 lore, after the opening of the Great Rift and the beginning of the Age of the Dark Imperium, the World Eaters are more present in the material universe than they have been since the Horus Heresy. The Blood Crusades continue across multiple fronts simultaneously. Warbands that have spent centuries in the Eye of Terror are emerging into real space with the increased instability of the Rift, making their transit both easier and more frequent. Angron himself, whose banishment from the First War for Armageddon lasted the 100 years the Grey Knights paid for with their lives, has been seen again, manifesting at various points of significant bloodshed. Drawn through the thinning barriers between the warp and the material universe by the sheer accumulated weight of violence that the Dark Millennium keeps generating. The World Eaters exist in the 41st millennium as a force that is philosophically pure in a way that almost nothing else in the setting can claim. They have no hidden agenda. They have no secret allegiances or political maneuvering or long-term strategic goals. They want one thing, which is more combat, more blood, more skulls for Khorne's throne, which has been accumulating for 10,000 years and shows no sign of reaching capacity. This makes them, paradoxically, one of the most readable factions in the entire Warhammer setting. You always know what the World Eaters want. You always know what they will do. The only question is whether you can stop them before they do it. The tragedy of the World Eaters is the thing that elevates them above simple villainy and makes them one of the most compelling factions in a setting that is absolutely full of compelling factions. They were not created to be what they became. The Warhounds of Terra were aggressive and difficult, but they were not the screaming tide of skull-collecting berserkers that they are today. That transformation required the specific horror of what was done to Angron on Nuceria, and then the specific failure of the Emperor and the Imperial system to address what the Butcher's Nails were doing to the Legion, and then the specific cruelty of the Horus Heresy and what it asked of them, and then the specific madness of Scalathrax and the 10,000 years of compounding damage that followed. At every step, there was a moment where a different choice might have produced a different outcome. The Emperor could have refused to abduct Angron from his dying stand on Nuceria and instead helped him win it. Or having abducted him, the Emperor could have found a way to remove the Butcher's Nails before they became irreversible. Or the War Council could have taken the escalating internal violence of the Legion seriously as a systemic problem rather than a management issue. Or Horus could have directed the World Eaters toward targets that did not require the abandonment of every remaining ethical principle. Any of these different choices might have broken the chain of causation that produced the Red Angel and his 10,000 years of blood. None of those choices were made. And so the World Eaters are what they are. The warriors who were supposed to be hunters, but became hunted, in the end, by the thing inside their own skulls. Men who were given devices designed to make them incapable of peace, and then told they were honored to bear that burden. A legion that was used as a hammer by an emperor who never asked what it cost the hammer to strike, until the hammer had swung so many times that the metal was past tempering and could only be used until it broke. They are still swinging. They may never stop. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the World Eaters are both the product and the proof of that darkness, not simply monsters, something more complicated and more tragic than that. Warriors who deserved better than they received from the very first moment they were brought into existence, and who have been paying the price of that failure every single day for 10,000 years. The Blood God collects. He always collects. And the World Eaters give him what he asks for, because the Butcher's Nails left them with no way to give him anything else. There it is, the full story, from the Terra where the Warhounds were born to the 41st millennium where they burn across the galaxy in the service of Khorne. Thank you genuinely for spending this time here. If you made it all the way to the end of this, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is made for, and I want to hear from you. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing that this is reaching people across the world and through every hour of the night and day. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. Every subscriber is how more content like this gets made. More deep dives into the dark corners of Warhammer lore. More stories of tragedy and violence, and the occasional precious thread of something that looks like meaning pulled out of the grim darkness. More is coming. The Emperor protects. Or he tries to. The World Eaters would argue otherwise. Script for Q40K. Optimized for 11 Labs voiceover generation. Estimated reading length, approximately 2 hours at standard narration pace. Extended reflection, the philosophy of Khorne, and the World Eaters' place within it. To truly understand the World Eaters in the current era, it is worth sitting with the specific theology and cosmology of Khorne, because the World Eaters are the most complete expression of that theology in the material universe, and their nature cannot be separated from the nature of the god they serve. Khorne is the oldest of the 4 Chaos gods, or so most accounts agree. which is a claim that requires some interpretation given that the Chaos Gods exist outside of time in ways that make chronological statements about them imprecise. What is meant, most accurately, is that Khorne is the first of the four to have accumulated sufficient power and coherence to become a distinct entity in the warp, and that this is because the impulse he embodies, violence, war, the shedding of blood, is the oldest and most fundamental of the impulses that power the Chaos Pantheon. Humanity, and indeed most sentient species, has been killing since before it was fully sentient. Long before complex emotions like desire and ambition and despair were generating the psychic energy that feeds the other Chaos Gods, the raw primal act of violence was filling the warp with the energy that Khorne drinks. He is not subtle. This is the first and most important thing to understand about Khorne relative to the other Chaos Gods. Tzeentch revels in complexity, in the web of schemes and counter-schemes and mutations of plan that play out across centuries of manipulation. Slaanesh embraces the entire spectrum of sensation and pursues its own goals with an aesthetic sensibility that values the manner of things as much as their outcome. Nurgle has a deep, patient, almost tender approach to his domain that produces the most genuinely strange of the four gods' relationships with their worshippers. Khorne wants blood. The blood of enemies, the blood of allies, the blood of his own champions when they fall in worthy combat. He does not distinguish, fundamentally, between whose blood is shed. He cares about the shedding, not the source. This is why the World Eaters at Scalathrax, killing each other as readily as they killed the Emperor's children, were not failing in their worship. They were succeeding at it. The Night of Madness was not a deviation from Khornate practice, but an expression of it. Khorne was pleased by Scalathrax precisely because it produced more blood, more violence, more death than a merely successful military campaign against a single opponent would have generated. The fact that much of that blood was World Eater's blood made no difference to him. Blood is blood. The Skull Throne does not care about the nationality of the skulls. This is also why the World Eaters are simultaneously the most devoted of Khorne's servants and the least able to advance any strategic objective for him. A chaos army that cannot distinguish between enemies and allies, that will turn on whatever is available when external targets are exhausted, that has no capacity for patience or deception or the tactical flexibility that strategic success requires, is not an instrument of conquest. It is an instrument of devastation, which is a different thing. You cannot build an empire with the World Eaters. You can level the ground on which an empire might be built by someone else, and for the Blood God, that is sufficient. There is a phrase that circulates in 40K lore around the distinction between Khorne's two great mandates, blood for the Blood God and skulls for the Skull Throne. These are not synonyms, though they are often treated as such in casual discussions of Khornate worship. They describe two related but distinct aspects of the offering Khorne demands. Blood is the act, the violence, the combat, the physical reality of one being destroying another. Skulls are the trophy, the proof, the record, the physical monument to the killing that has been done. Blood without skulls is killing without acknowledgement. Skulls without blood are trophies taken without proper contest, dishonorably, in a way that Khorne actually finds offensive. The Blood God wants both the act and its documentation, the violence and its evidence, the combat and the proof that combat was genuinely undertaken against worthy opponents. The World Eaters collect skulls with a dedication that goes beyond mere ritual. The skulls on their armor, on their weapons, carried on chains at their belts, mounted on poles, piled before their warlords as tribute. These are not decoration. They are the record of service. They are proof, physical and immediate, that the warrior bearing them has done what Khorne asks, and done it to opponents who were worth the asking. There is a hierarchy within skull collection that is not written down anywhere in any official document, but that every World Eater's warrior understands. The skull of a powerful opponent is worth more than the skull of a weak one. The skull of a hero is worth more than the skull of a soldier. The skull of a Primarch, or a Chapter Master, or any being of comparable power, would be worth more than almost anything else a warrior in the material universe could offer the Blood God. Karn's helmet counter, the kill tally that Horus gave him before the heresy's end, is, in some ways, the most literal possible expression of this theology. a numerical record of service, a quantification of devotion. Every time the counter increments, another skull has been added to the abstract pile that Karn maintains as his offering. The fact that the counter is visible to others built into his helmet's lens, where it can be seen by anyone facing him in combat, makes it a statement as much as a record. It says, "Look at this number. Consider what it means that someone bearing this number is standing in front of you right now. Consider what your odds are." The relationship between the World Eaters and the other Khornate forces, they encounter demons of Khorne, mortal cultists, other warbands, is complex in ways that the World Eaters' apparent simplicity might lead you to underestimate. They are not unified with all Khornate forces, simply by virtue of shared Olivmark. The Khorne berserkers of one warband will absolutely fight the Khorne berserkers of another warband if the two groups come into contact without a clear external target available, because the Butcher's Nails do not recognize ideological solidarity as a category worth respecting. The Nails know proximity and movement and potential threat, and another heavily armed warrior represents potential threat regardless of whose skull they carry on their belt. This is managed, to the extent it can be managed at all, through the specific hierarchy of personal authority that characterizes World Eaters' warbands. The leader of a warband commands loyalty not through institutional authority, but through the specific demonstration of being more dangerous than everyone else present. A Chaos Lord, or Exalted Champion, who can back up their claim to leadership with the physical evidence of their combat record, their size, their weapons, their kill trophies, the marks of Khorne's favor visible on their body, and their armor, commands the warband because no one wants to be the one who challenges them. This is not a stable system. It requires the leader to continuously demonstrate the quality that grants their authority, which in practice means they need to be at the front of every engagement, taking the most dangerous opponents and not backing down from any challenge. It is a system that selects for exactly the kind of warrior it produces, someone who cannot stop, who has no off switch, who equates leadership entirely with the willingness to be the most dangerous thing in any room they enter. Extended reflection. What makes the World Eaters different from other Chaos Legions? The Chaos Space Marine factions in Warhammer 40,000 are a study in contrasts, because each of the traitor legions fell to chaos for different reasons and in different ways, and each has been shaped by 10,000 years of existence within the Eye of Terror into something distinct from all the others. It is worth, here in this extended reflection, considering what makes the World Eaters specifically different from their fellow traitor legions, because understanding those differences clarifies what the World Eaters are and why they occupy the role they do within the wider Chaos faction. The Death Guard are, in many ways, the World Eaters' most obvious opposite number, where the World Eaters are fire and speed, and the furious expenditure of energy and explosive violence. The Death Guard under their patron Nurgle are patience and endurance, and the slow, steady, unstoppable advance of decay. The Death Guard have Primarch Mortarion, who is still present and still leading them in the current era. They have organizational coherence that the World Eaters lack. They pursue long-term strategic objectives. They can hold territory, maintain supply lines within the logic of chaos. Think in terms of campaigns rather than engagements. Everything that the World Eaters cannot do, the Death Guard can, and vice versa. The raw offensive punch of the World Eaters in close combat is something the Death Guard, for all their resilience and durability, cannot match. The Thousand Sons are perhaps the most tragic of the traitor legions in certain interpretations, though the World Eaters have a strong claim to that title too. The Thousand Sons were masters of psychic power, who were destroyed by the same chaos god they had tried to understand, and who now exist as barely animate suits of armor filled with dust, their souls consumed by Tsaench, with only a small number of living sorcerers preserving any genuine intelligence within the Legion. Their tragedy is intellectual. They sought knowledge and found only the specific kind of knowledge that costs everything else. The World Eaters' tragedy is physical and neurological. They were given devices that consumed the parts of them that would have allowed them to choose differently, and then judged for the choices those devices left available. The Emperor's children are, in some ways, the most aesthetically developed of the traitor legions, and their relationship with the World Eaters has a specific quality of mutual contempt that finds its ultimate expression at Scalathrax. Where the World Eater's corruption has produced a focus on simplicity, the reduction of everything to its most violent element, the Emperor's children have gone in the opposite direction, into excess and complexity, and the infinite proliferation of sensation beyond any limit that morality or sanity would previously have imposed. Fulgrim's legion pursues the perfection of experience, which in Slaaneish's service means pursuing the extremes of experience, including experiences that cause the worst suffering, because sensation at its most extreme is what Slaanesh craves and what the Emperor's children provide. There is no common ground between this and the World Eater's specific form of devotion. Khorne actively disdains the pursuit of pleasure, considering it weak and degraded. The Emperor's children, from a World Eater's perspective, are not allies who happen to serve a different god, but a living insult to the values, if values is the right word, for what the Nails have left that the World Eaters embody. The Word-Bearers are perhaps the closest to genuine theological allies that the World Eaters have, in the specific sense that the Word-Bearers worship chaos undivided and therefore include Khorne within their devotions, and in the more personal sense that Lorgar's relationship with Angron during the Shadow Crusade created a bond between the two legions that outlasted the heresy. But the Word-Bearers are ritualists and scholars of chaos, believers in its theological significance, worshippers who approach the chaos gods with something that might, at a stretch, be called reverence and contemplation. The World Eaters approach Khorne with the specific straightforwardness of beings who have no capacity for anything more complex than the immediate expression of what they are. These are different ways of being chaotic. What all of this adds up to is a traitor legion that occupies a genuinely unique position in the Chaos faction. The World Eaters are the purest military instrument the forces of Chaos have access to, not the most subtle, not the most strategically capable, not the most politically sophisticated, but in the specific and limited sense of applying overwhelming melee violence to a designated target as quickly and completely as possible. They are unmatched by anything the Chaos Pantheon can put into the field. Abaddon knows this. Every commander who has ever had the World Eaters as notional allies knows this, along with the corresponding knowledge that allies is a term that requires significant qualification when applied to beings who cannot reliably distinguish between targets once the blood starts flowing. They are a hammer, the finest and most dangerous hammer that Chaos can field. And like all hammers, they are most useful when in the hands of someone who knows what they are trying to break, and most dangerous when swung without direction. Extended reflection, the warrior's code and its inversion in the World Eaters. There is a concept that runs through the martial traditions of most cultures in human history, and that appears in one form or another in almost every civilization that has organized itself around the need for warriors. The idea that there is a code to honorable combat, that being a warrior is not simply about the capacity to kill, but about the restraint that is exercised in that capacity. That the highest expression of martial ability is not the willingness to use it indiscriminately, but the wisdom to use it well, proportionally, in service of something beyond the individual warrior's immediate desires. This concept takes different forms in different traditions. The chivalric code of medieval European knight culture emphasized protection of the weak and mercy to the defeated. The Bushido tradition of Japanese warrior culture emphasized loyalty, honor, and the willingness to die rather than bring shame to one's commitments. The military ethics of later periods emphasized proportionality, distinction between combatants and non-combatants, and the obligation to treat prisoners in accordance with specific standards. These are different expressions of the same underlying idea, that there is a way to be a warrior that is more than simply being someone who kills effectively. The Space Marines of the Warhammer 40,000 setting are built, at least nominally, around a version of this idea. They are warriors, yes, and warriors of extraordinary capability. But they are also supposed to be the Emperor's finest beings, whose excellence encompasses not just their combat effectiveness, but their judgment and their restraint, and their ability to serve as the pointed tip of imperial expansion rather than a force of indiscriminate destruction. The ideal Space Marine is someone who knows when to fight and when to hold back, who can distinguish between the enemy to be destroyed and the civilian to be protected, who serves the Emperor's vision rather than simply their own appetite for combat. The World Eaters represent the complete inversion of this ideal, and they represent it not because they chose to invert it, but because the butcher's nails destroyed the neurological foundations that would have allowed them to sustain it. The nails did not simply amplify aggression. They removed the capacity for the specific kind of restraint that the warrior's code is built on. They consumed the parts of the brain that allow a fighter to choose mercy when mercy is available. They made the idea of stopping, of holding back, of making a distinction between a defeated enemy and a dead one, genuinely neurologically difficult to execute, because the nails treated the drive to continue killing as something to be amplified and the impulse to stop as something to be suppressed. This is one of the most genuinely horrific aspects of the butcher's nails, and one that is sometimes not sufficiently appreciated in discussions that focus primarily on the combat enhancement they provide. They did not turn the World Eaters into better killers. They turned the World Eaters into beings who could not choose not to kill. The distinction matters. A better killer is someone who is more effective at what they choose to do. Someone who cannot choose not to kill has had their capacity for choice, at least in this domain, surgically removed. The World Eaters are not warriors who fight with exceptional ferocity. They are people from whom the option to not be in a state of ferocious combat readiness has been taken. The tragedy of this is compounded by the fact that the World Eaters' pre-nails history, in the person of the Warhounds and the specific culture they were developing before Angron's arrival, showed elements of something that might have developed into a genuine martial code under different circumstances. The Warhounds' internal discipline, harsh as it was an attempt to channel and manage a tendency toward uncontrolled violence through structure. The standards they held each other to, the severe internal consequences for warriors who stepped too far out of line, these were the beginning of a code, not a generous or gentle one, not one that would have looked at all like the chivalric tradition, but a code nonetheless, a set of values that said there is a way to be what we are that is better than simply being uncontrolled. Angron's arrival and the Nails program ended that development. The code that was beginning to form was burned away, along with the neurological capacities that would have sustained it. And what replaced it was not another code, even a brutal one. What replaced it was the absence of the concept entirely, the conversion of warriors who had been trying to be something more than simply effective killers into warriors who could be nothing else. This is what the 41st Millennium World Eaters have lost, if lost is the right word, for something that was never fully possessed to begin with. They are warriors with no warrior's code. They are fighters with no philosophy of combat beyond the combat itself. They are the thing that a martial tradition is built, in part, to prevent. Violence without purpose, killing without context, strength without the wisdom, to know when strength serves and when it merely destroys. And Khorne loves them for it, because Khorne has no use for warriors' codes either. Extended reflection on the question of sympathy for the World Eaters. The question of whether the World Eaters deserve sympathy is one that 40K lore raises without fully resolving, and it is worth addressing directly because it gets at something important about how the faction functions within the setting. On one hand, they are mass murderers. They have killed worlds. They have participated in genocide on a scale that even the grimdark setting struggles to fully contextualize. They fought at the Siege of Terra against the defenders of humanity, and they did so without mercy and without any moment of hesitation or doubt. They serve a God who is defined by nothing except the quantity of death that his followers produce. The skulls on their belts and their armor are the skulls of people who had lives and relationships and futures that were ended. The blood on their chain axes is the blood of human beings and the blood of other beings who had whatever equivalent of humanity their species possessed. There is no way to look at all of that and conclude that sympathy, in the normal sense, is the appropriate response. On the other hand, the butcher's nails, the specific, mechanical, verifiable fact that the World Eater's capacity for the restraint and judgment and moral reflection that would have allowed them to be anything other than what they are was removed progressively and irreversibly by devices that were implanted without their full understanding of the consequences. Khorne chose the nails, many others chose the nails, but they chose them within a context created by a Primarch who bore the original nails without any choice at all, within a Legion culture that had been shaped by that Primarch's pain, within an imperial system that allowed the damage to compound over years and decades without meaningful intervention. And Angron himself never chose anything that was done to him on Nuceria. The child who landed on that world in a damaged life pod and was sold into slavery and had devices hammered into his skull did not choose any of that. He did not choose the arena. He did not choose the pain. He did not choose to have the parts of his mind that might have allowed him to grow into something other than the Red Angel burned away by a technology he did not design and could not remove. The 40K setting is not gentle about this question. It does not resolve it in favor of sympathy, exactly, because the World Eaters continue to do terrible things right up to and including the present moment of the narrative. It also does not resolve it in favor of pure condemnation, because the lore consistently frames the World Eaters' story with enough attention to the circumstances that created them that simple condemnation feels inadequate. What it does instead is hold both things simultaneously. Terrible people who did terrible things and continue to do terrible things. People who became terrible in ways that were not entirely within their control, who were failed by every institution and individual who might have intervened before the failure became irreversible. Both of these things are true about the World Eaters. Neither cancels the other out. This is one of the things that makes the World Eaters one of the most genuinely interesting factions in a setting that has many interesting factions. They are not simple villains, though they do villainous things. They are not tragic heroes, though they have tragedy woven into the very fabric of what they are. They are something more complicated, the product of a system that failed them at every level, who have then gone on to perpetuate that failure by failing others in turn, in a cycle of violence that the butcher's nails ensure can never be fully broken from within. The only being in the World Eater's story who has shown any consistent resistance to this cycle is Karn himself, and Karn's resistance is of a deeply limited kind. He holds on to his identity. He insists on knowing who he is. He refuses to surrender the last fragments of his self to the complete possession that the nails are driving toward. And this changes nothing about what he does, which is to kill. It means only that he kills consciously rather than automatically, which is a distinction that matters enormously to him and very little to the people he kills. This is the World Eaters in a single image. Warriors who remember what they were, who cannot stop being what they are, who are aware of the gap between those two things and have nothing available to bridge it. 10,000 years of awareness of an impossibility that no amount of awareness can resolve. The blood flows on. The skulls accumulate. The throne of corn grows higher. And somewhere in the eye of terror, the engines of the conqueror still hum with the specific vibration of a vessel that has been at war for 10,000 years without ever fully returning from it. If you made it to the end, genuinely thank you. This is what this channel exists to do, to take the lore of Warhammer 40,000 seriously, to sit with it long enough that the emotional weight of it becomes accessible, to treat it not as a game setting or a collection of statistics, but as a genuinely rich and genuinely dark imaginary universe that has things to say about violence and choice and the consequences of using people as tools. Drop a comment with your location and time. Subscribe if you have not already. There is more coming, and the next deep dive is one that I think will surprise you. The Emperor protects. The World Eaters would beg to differ. Extended reflection. The architecture of a warband. How the World Eaters operate in the field. Understanding the World Eaters as an abstract, historical, and philosophical phenomenon is one thing. Understanding how they actually operate in practice, how a World Eaters warband organizes itself, and moves, and fights, and sustains itself between engagements, is equally important for grasping why they remain such a formidable and terrifying presence in the 41st millennium, despite having none of the organizational infrastructure that most military forces depend on. A World Eaters warband in the current era is organized around a central figure whose authority rests entirely on demonstrated personal power. This is not a metaphor for leadership by example. It is literally the mechanism by which command is allocated. The person leading the warband is the person who has proven, in ways visible to everyone in the warband, that they are more dangerous than the alternatives. This proof must be maintained continuously, not through abstract reputation, but through the ongoing evidence of combat performance. A World Eater's Chaos Lord, or Exalted Champion, who stops demonstrating their superiority in combat, does not hold their position for long. The butcher's nails do not respect institutional authority or the accumulated weight of past performance. They respect the person who is right now, in this moment, the most lethal individual in their immediate environment. This creates a warband culture that is, in a very specific sense, meritocratic. Though it is a meritocracy, evaluated on an extremely narrow set of criteria. The only currency is martial effectiveness. The only resume is the record of kills and the marks of Khorne's favor on the leader's body. The only campaign promise is the implicit guarantee that following this person into battle will produce the combat that the nails demand. Leaders who can deliver this are followed, sometimes with a loyalty that is functionally absolute, even though it is based entirely on pragmatic calculation rather than affection or ideology. Leaders who cannot deliver it are replaced, often in the same moment when the failure of delivery becomes apparent. The warband's secondary structure beneath its leader consists of champions who have earned individual recognition through the volume and quality of their killing. These champions lead smaller subunits within the warband groups of berserkers who have formed bonds of familiarity around particular champions. Eightbound, who operate in the vicinity of leaders whose authority they respect for reasons that are more warp-based than conventional. The structure is loose and subject to constant renegotiation, but it is not entirely absent. World Eaters' warbands can maintain organizational coherence through extended campaigns when the leadership is sufficiently strong and the targets sufficiently available. What they cannot do is maintain it when the leadership is absent or the targets run out. Tactically, a World Eaters' warband operates on a very simple model that is extremely difficult to counter effectively. They close distance to the enemy as fast as possible. Every tool available to them serves this goal. Transport vehicles to carry berserkers to the edge of close combat range, movement-enhancing cornate blessings to allow warriors who have disembarked from transport to cover the remaining ground faster than normal sprint speed should allow, the blood surge capability that gives experienced berserkers a sudden burst of movement triggered by proximity to enemy blood. The entire art of World Eaters' tactics, to the extent that tactics is an appropriate word for something this direct, is about shortening the time between engagement and melee, because melee is where they are strongest in ranged combat. While they can do it, is not where their advantages are concentrated. Once in melee, the World Eaters do not disengage. This is the thing that experienced commanders who have faced them report most consistently as the element that defeats their otherwise sound defensive planning. Most tactical models for infantry combat include an assumption that the attacker, having achieved an objective, or having taken sufficient casualties, will eventually break off and allow the defender time to reconsolidate. The World Eaters do not break off. The nails do not have a signal for sufficient, and the cornate blessings that sustain the warriors, through what would be lethal combat damage for most Astartes, mean that the casualty thresholds that would normally trigger withdrawal are reached and passed without any change in behavior. They fight until they have killed everything in front of them, or until they are physically unable to continue, and the threshold for physical inability is set substantially higher in World Eaters' warriors than in almost anything else that fights on foot in the material universe. Land Raiders and Rhinos serve as the primary transport vehicles for World Eaters' assault forces. These are ancient and battered machines, maintained by the warband's Daemon Smiths, rather than the traditional tech marines of loyalist Astartes, and their maintenance is guided by different principles. Where a loyalist tech marine maintains their vehicles through prayer to the machine spirit and careful adherence to the sacred rites of Omnissiah, a Daemon Smith binds demonic entities into the machine's workings, which produces vehicles that may behave in somewhat unpredictable ways, but that also possess a resilience and an aggression in their function that conventionally maintained vehicles lack. A World Eater's Land Raider's machine spirit, such as it is, wants to move forward and crush things. This is entirely compatible with its crew's intentions. The warband sustains itself between engagements through raiding. There are no supply lines in the conventional sense, no logistics train, no hierarchy of procurement and distribution. What the warband needs, it takes from whatever it defeats. This includes not just material supplies, but also new recruits humans who survive encounters with World Eaters' warbands, and who demonstrate sufficient aggression and drive to be worth the investment of transformation, are sometimes Kakit, taken and subjected to the process that will eventually produce new berserkers. This process is brutal, and the failure rate is high, but the Eye of Terror provides a steady supply of candidates whose lives have already been sufficiently terrible that the prospect of becoming something worse does not automatically disqualify the option. Extended reflection. The return of Angron, and what it means for the current era. The question of Angron's status in the current 41st millennium lore is one that the game's canon has not yet fully resolved, which is appropriate for a being whose existence occupies the space between the material and warp realms in a way that makes precise accounting difficult. What is established is that the banishment inflicted at Armageddon by the Grey Knights had a finite term, 100 years, and 100 years has long since passed. The Angron who returns to the material universe in the current era is not the same being who led the World Eaters through the heresy, even accounting for the transformation into a daemon prince that occurred on Nuceria. 10,000 years in the warp have their own effects, and the warp is not a neutral medium that preserves entities within it unchanged. It is a realm of constant psychic pressure and mutating energy, and even beings as powerful as daemon princes are shaped by extended immersion in it. Angron has been, by the current era's accounts, subsumed more deeply into Khorne's direct will than he was at the time of the heresy. The fragments of the man who chose to stand on that mountain in Nuceria, who loved the people beside him in the slave pits, who felt anything that could be called grief when the Emperor took him away. Those fragments were already vanishingly small by the end of the heresy. After 10,000 years in the warp, in direct service to the Blood God, they may be gone entirely. What remains is something that the current era of lore tends to depict as a force of nature more than a commander. Angron does not lead World Eaters' warbands in the current era, in the same way he led the 12th Legion during the Crusade. He manifests where the blood is thickest, where the concentration of Khornate energy in the material universe is sufficient to anchor his presence, and he fights until the source of that anchoring is exhausted, or until the Grey Knights, or some comparably powerful entity, disrupts his manifestation. He is not a strategist. He is not a commander. He is a weapon, like his sons, like the things the butcher's nails made of them all, but a weapon on a scale that the sons can only look up at rather than stand beside. The new model that Games Workshop released for Angron in 2023, as part of the World Eaters range refresh, is the physical expression of what the current lore describes. The figure stands at a scale appropriate for a Daemon Primarch, which is to say, significantly larger than any other infantry model in the range, with the specific visual design of a being who has moved comprehensively past the human into something that borrows human features as reference points, but is clearly operating according to a different logic. The wings of bloody sinew, the brass and iron of his physical form, the weapons that are as much expressions of his nature as they are tools. The butcher's nails still visible on his skull, because even in his daemonic form, they are present, still working, still doing what they were built to do, to a consciousness that is now beyond the point where the work they do matters in any conventional sense. He cannot be permanently banished from the material universe. This is new lore added in the World Eaters Codex of 2023, and it changes the calculus of how the Imperium can respond to his manifestation. The Grey Knights can disrupt him, as they did at Armageddon. The Sisters of Silence and other organizations with specific anti-daemonic capability can make his presence in the material universe costly enough that he withdraws of his own volition or is pushed back. But the specific ritual of binding and banishment that was performed at Armageddon, the one that the Grey Knights paid for in lives and that kept him out for 100 years, is not something that can be repeated with the same effect. The relationship between Angron and the Warp, between Angron and Khorne, has become too intimate for a disruption of that kind to create a separation of that duration again. This is, in the terminology of the 40K setting, a threat that has become structural rather than episodic. Angron is not a crisis to be managed and resolved. He is a permanent feature of the threat landscape, a power that exists and that the Imperium must account for as an ongoing reality rather than a problem to be solved. This is appropriate for what he is. The result of failures that accumulated over centuries and could not be undone when they became clear, now manifesting as an eternal consequence that the Imperium cannot excise. The World Eaters in the current era with their Daemon Primarch loose in the galaxy and the Blood Crusades active across multiple fronts simultaneously, represent a threat level that the Imperium's resources are not configured to comprehensively address. The Indomitus Crusade, Guilliman's response to the crisis of the Dark Millennium, has had some success in reinforcing threatened worlds and providing the Primaris Space Marines as a new wave of defenders. But the World Eaters are not a problem that defending worlds can solve. They do not hold territory, they do not occupy and administrate. They descend, they destroy, and they move on, or they are eventually destroyed themselves and replaced by the next warband. The supply of warbands from the Eye of Terror, now that the Great Rift has improved their access to the material universe, is not one that can be exhausted by military attrition alone. This is the World Eater's specific form of power in the current era. Not the ability to conquer, but the ability to exhaust. To force the Imperium to spend resources defending against attacks that cannot all be predicted or prevented, to draw defenders away from other crises, to address immediate emergencies, to create conditions of constant pressure that no defensive arrangement can fully absorb. They are, in the end, exactly what they were always going to be. The warhounds that the Emperor built on Terra, made sharper and more dangerous and more completely pointed at a single purpose, by everything that was done to them, and everything that happened to them, and everything that they did to themselves. The Unstoppable Legion. Not because they cannot be destroyed. Individual warbands are destroyed regularly. Individual warriors die, or are banished, or are captured. In the rare cases where capture is meaningful, but because the impulse that drives them, the butcher's nails and the blood, God's demand, and the 10,000 years of momentum behind both, is not something that can be extinguished by winning any particular battle. You can win every battle against the World Eaters and still not be done with them, because they will come back. They always come back. Blood for the Blood God, skulls for the Skull Throne. The throne has room for more.